Okay, everybody, welcome back to our weekly Thursday class. Very excited to get this back and going. We had camp, we had a lot of stuff going on, and now we're getting back into the grind. I'd like to thank Anonymous for sponsoring this week's class in honor of helping to speed up the coming of Mashiach immediately. May thank you for your contribution, and may you be blessed for causing all this beautiful Torah study to happen both here live and whoever's going to watch this later on YouTube. Please enjoy the brownies and drinks in the corner over here. Bring it back to your seat, obviously. Don't stand in the corner. We are continuing this series for a short time. God willing, we have a new class in the works. I sent out a survey to people in the community what kind of topic they would enjoy learning about. It seems that the consensus is people want to learn about Kabbalah. So we'll see what we can come up with, God willing. If you'd like to sponsor a future class, please reach out to me, rabbi@jewisherie.com. And speaking of sponsoring, we will also start off with some tzedakah, some charity. Grab a coin if you're at home, take a dollar bill, put it in the box, and you can pass that along. Okay. As usual, we're going to start with a quick halacha, Jewish law, Jewish practice. Chapter 3 in the abridged code of Jewish law, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. The laws pertaining to the manner of dressing and walking, a bunch of different stuff. We're not going to cover everything. We're going to jump around a little bit. Hope you can hear me on the mic. Okay, so I'll read number 1 and law number 3. Sorry, law number 3 and 4 maybe. We'll see. So law number 1 says, the prophet states, walk modestly with your God. Accordingly, a person should act modestly in all his ways. Therefore, when he puts on or takes off his robe or other garments, he should be very careful not to expose his body. Rather, he should put on and take off his clothes while lying covered on his bed. He should not say, I am in an inner room in darkness. Who will see me? Because the Holy One, blessed be he. The entire earth is full of his glory, and darkness is as light before him. Blessed be he. Modesty and shame bring a person to submission before him. Blessed be he. On a practical level, we try as best we can not to expose our body. Even if I'm in my bedroom, who sees me? Hashem sees you, and we have to have a sense of dignity, realizing that Hashem sees us at every moment. So you do the best you can. I will skip to number 3. A person should not dress in expensive clothes, for this will lead to pride. Nor should he wear very cheap or dirty clothes, lest he be scorned by the public. Rather, he should wear clean clothes of average price. Ends off, a person should sell everything he owns, even the beams of his house, in order to buy shoes for his feet. Fascinating. Okay. Let's get into our class here. Okay. If you like measurements and you like architecture and you like holy stuff, it's going to be a class for you. Even if you don't like any of that stuff, it's still a class for you. Okay. The raised temple. Copies are over here if you need one. The raised temple. The holy temple was not built on flat ground, but rather atop a storied structure on a mountain. Was this just an architectural marvel, or is there a deeper significance to this? Okay. What we're going to revolve around here is the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, what we're going to call the Beis HaMikdash, because that's what it's called, the House of Holiness, the literal translation, was the ultimate synagogue. It is where Jews for hundreds of years, both the first temple and the second temple, offered sacrifices and prayed to God, and everything. That was the epicenter of Judaism. So there's a lot to learn about it. There's a lot to appreciate about it. And if we really understood what it was to the best of our ability, we wouldn't be confused when we hear that we were still mourning the destruction of the temple, and Tisha B'Av is coming up. It was really that important. We're going to focus on one seemingly insignificant detail about the temple, and we're going to really expound on it. So let's see. Opening. Do you have opening in yours? I think you do. The period of the 3 weeks, known as the Yemei Ben HaMetzarim, spans from the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, marking the breach of the Jerusalem's walls during the Second Temple's destruction, to the fast of Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of both the First and Second Temples, which were destroyed on the same day, by the way, 400 and so years apart. These days are marked by mourning practices that intensify as Tisha. What I have is, you don't have what I'm reading, what I'm saying. This is just the introduction. These days are marked by mourning practices that intensify as Tisha B'Av approaches. Weddings are not held, orchestras do not play, and people refrain from taking haircuts as well. A comprehensive set of laws gives these days a distinctive character. The Rebbe instituted the study of Torah sections that discuss redemption and the building of the temple during this period. The Rebbe explained that these days are particularly suited for studying such topics as stated in the Midrash Tanchuma, the Torah portion of Tzav, number 14, which we're about to read inside. So if you see it on page 1, the Midrash says like this. This is the basis of why we're giving this class today. When God showed Ezekiel the design of the temple, what did he say? Describe the temple to the house of Israel so that they will be ashamed of their iniquities, of their sins, and they will measure its design. Ezekiel replied to God, Master of the universe, we are currently in exile in our enemy's land, and you want me to go and tell Israel the temple's design? Can they build it now? Leave it until we come out of exile, then I'll inform them. God answered Ezekiel, because my children are in exile, should the building of my house be postponed? No. Reading about its construction in the Torah is as great as actually building it. Go tell them to study the temple's design in the Torah, and I will consider it as if they're engaged in its construction. In that light, we will dedicate our lesson to studying the design of the temple and its implications of on our lives. Okay, starting in section A, we're going to take a tour of the Holy Temple. Hold on to your seats. The temporary Mishkan and the eternal temple. So we're going to start with source 1, which is Maimonides, Rambam, from his Mishnah Torah, the laws of the temple, right at the beginning. He says, it is a positive commandment to build a house for God, where sacrifices can be offered. So this is just the most important thing, by the way, to know about the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. It was a place where we offered sacrifices, we served God, all those beautiful things. But the core is you're fulfilling a mitzvah. God commanded us, build for me a house where I can reside in. That's it. When you build such a house, you fulfilled the mitzvah. That's what the basis of the Holy Temple is. Okay? 3 times a year it is celebrated in. As the verse states, you shall build for me a temple. The Mishkan built by Moses is explained in the Torah. It was a temporary solution. As the verse states, for you have not come until now to the rest and permanent portion. Yeah? So the very first sanctuary was the Mishkan, which the fancy English is tabernacle, apparently, referred to in the Torah as the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. This portable structure accompanied the Israelites during their 40-year journey in the wilderness, being dismantled and reassembled at each encampment. When the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, they set up the Mishkan in Gilgal for 14 years. And this period was marked by the Jewish people acclimating to their new land and engaging in the conquest and division of territories. Subsequently, the Jews established a more permanent Mishkan in Shiloh. The tented roof was the same one that had traveled with them in the desert, but the wood panels were replaced with some fixed stone walls. The Shiloh Mishkan stood for 369 years until it was destroyed by the Philistines. After the destruction of Shiloh, the Mishkan moved to the city of Nob, and after Nob was destroyed, 369. Yeah. And after Nob was destroyed, it moved to Givon. The Mishkan resided in these 2 cities for a combined total of 57 years. Now, just to reiterate what I've said many times in these classes, the Mishkan was a mobile home version of the permanent Holy Temple in Jerusalem.
396, after that went to where?
369 in Shiloh. Afterwards, it went to Nov. Yeah, Nov. And after, it went to Givon.
And I think it was in Kiryat Yarim.
Oh, sure. Okay, so going further in Maimonides, After the temple was built in Jerusalem, it became prohibited to build a temple for God anywhere else and to offer sacrifices there. There can be no temple for future generations except in Jerusalem and specifically on Mount Moriah. After which the verse states, and David said, this is the house of God, and this is an altar for the offerings of Israel, and this is my place of rest forever. Okay, so the temple was built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a site considered sacred since the creation of the world. Yeah. Maimonides identifies the foundation stone located in the Holy of Holies, which we'll talk about soon, as a starting point of creation, and the site of the altar as the place where Adam was created. After Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden, he offered the first sacrifice on this spot where the Holy of Holies is. Cain, Abel, and Noah also brought their offerings there. The most significant event associated with the Temple Mount was the binding of Isaac. As described in the Torah, it says, take your son and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Okay. Let's go to source 2. Let's get into the measurements over here. We'll gain an appreciation of the size of the temple and how things were located and where and how big they were and what their purpose was. Source 2, this is from the Mishnah of Tractate Midot. So you're on page 2 in your booklets. The Temple Mount was 500 amma, which is cubits in English. It's about 1.5 feet, according to most opinions. The Temple Mount was 500 amma by 500 amma. Okay, so if it's 1.5 feet per amma, so if we want to do the math, 500 times 1.5 is 750 feet. 750 feet was the Temple Mount. No, did I do that math right? Or not for now. The Temple Mount, also known as Mount Moriah, is located at the edge of Jerusalem. The leveled and sanctified area of the Temple Mount is a square plot measuring 240 meters by 240 meters, covering a total area of 57,600 square meters. Surrounding this area was a tall wall was constructed featuring 5 entrances, one on each side, with the southern side having 2 entrances. You can see this in the picture in your booklets. You see all 5 entrances. It's in Hebrew, but you can see the arrows pointing at the 5 entrances. The thing in the sort of off-center, that is the actual Beis HaMikdash. Going further, page 3. Beyond it was a fence 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths high, and beyond there was the chel, 10 amos high. Yeah, so the area immediately adjacent to the temple itself is called the chel. You can see this in the picture, that area of steps. This space consists of 12 large steps leading up to the temple. It holds a higher level of sanctity, of holiness than the rest of the Temple Mount because of its proximity to the temple. And individuals who are ritually impure due to contact with the dead are not permitted to enter. To enforce this restriction, a physical barrier was necessary. Thus, an 80-centimeter high fence called the soreg was constructed to alert people to the prohibited areas. You can see this in the picture. There's the fence over here, the soreg, and this is the chel, the area at the steps, and that is where if somebody was ritually impure, they could not enter. Well, ritually impure from contacting a dead person. Okay, moving on to page 4, the women's courtyard. It was called the Ezras Nashim. Okay? The women's courtyard was 135 amma by 135 amma. It contained 4 chambers at its 4 corners, each 40 by 40 amma. And you can see in the picture, the lower half of the picture is the women's courtyard. So the women's courtyard, what was it used for? It was a large area where everybody, men, women, children, could enter at any time. I think children, of course, children, why not? Could enter at any time, provided they were ritually pure. They were tahor. This courtyard hosted significant celebrations, including the joyous Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the water drawing festival, and the famous Hakel assembly. For these large events, separate areas for men and women were needed. To address this, a raised balcony was constructed for the women. This balcony served as the prototype for the women's section in later synagogues. Grab some grub and grab a seat. You can also grab a copy of the curriculum. For these large events, separate areas for men and women were needed. I just said this. The balcony, in other words, it was called the women's courtyard not because it was only open to women, but rather because it contained the women's balcony. Okay. Now we're going to zoom into the women's courtyard for a moment. And you can see that at the bottom of page 4, there's a picture of it. It's like a plus sign with 4 rooms in the corners. Okay, page 5, the Israelite courtyard and the priestly courtyard. 15 steps. Now, these steps are going to become important soon. 15 steps went up from it, the women's courtyard, to the courtyard of the Israelites, corresponding to the 15 rungs of psalms recited by the Levites in their songs. Yeah, so between the women's courtyard and the next section, which was the Israelites' courtyard, the Ezras Yisrael, there were 15 rounded steps. You can actually see that at the top of the picture on the bottom, page 4. Right there, you can see it. Very hard to see. It's a little small, but you can see the rounded steps over here. You see that on the bottom, page 4. Oh. Got it. Okay. So there were 15 rounded steps that led up to the inner courtyard. This section contained the temple itself, where the sacrificial offerings were conducted. So right now we're still in the outer courtyard. We're not even in the temple itself. The courtyard of the Israelites was 100, we're on page 5, 135 by 135 amma. The courtyard of the priests, which was the next section, was 135 by 12 amma. It was very narrow. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, there was a step, an amma high, on which a platform was placed, and it had 3 steps, each of a half an amma in height. In this way, the courtyard of the priests was made 2.5 amos higher than that of Israelite courtyard. Okay, so the lowest section of the inner courtyard is the Israelite courtyard. Okay, you can see it if you look in the, I think it's the bottom page 5, yeah? Bottom page 5 on the left side. Okay, this is already the inner courtyard. So the front is pointing to the, you can see where it's labeled, the blue Israelite courtyard, red priestly courtyard, and the black part is the 3 steps separating the courtyards. So any ritually pure Jew could enter this area, the Ezras Yisrael, the Israelite courtyard, without any special permission, as long as they were pure. Beyond this courtyard, a series of steps led to the priestly courtyard, the Ezras Kohanim. Only priests, the Kohanim, or Israelites with a specific need to bring a sacrifice could enter this section. Okay. Going further, page 6, we move on to the altar. So we're going deeper and deeper, as you see. The altar was 32 by 32 amma. Huge, by the way. If you always see pictures of it, sometimes if you get to see pictures of it, but it's actually quite big. This is not including the ramp that you see in the picture on page 6. The actual square section itself was 32 by 32 amma. The wash basin was between the hall, the ulam, and the altar. And you can see that in the picture as well. It's the thing toward the closer to you that has an arrow pointing at what's in Hebrew words over there. Yeah, as one moves further inside, they encounter the altar where sacrifices were offered and the wash basin, the kior, used by the Kohanim for ritual purification before beginning their service. And if you remember many moons ago when we were learning the halacha, the Jewish law before these classes, we mentioned that this is one of the reasons why we wash our hands in the morning. Just like a priest, the Kohanim, they would wash their hands before their service, so too we wash our hands in the beginning of the day to prepare ourselves to serve Hashem throughout the day. Now we're going to go even further into the actual structure of the temple itself, which is the big building in the middle. You'll see in a moment. Which contains the holy, the Kodesh, and the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadashim. So we see the central structure of the temple, which is called the Heichal. There's 12 wide and majestic steps, totaling about 3 meters in height, leading up to it. The Heichal was the central structure of this complex, including the antechamber, which is called the Holy of the Kodesh, and the Kodesh HaKadashim, the Holy of Holies. Its dimensions were 100 amma by 100 amma, with a height of 100 amma, which is approximately 160 feet, the height of a 17-story building. Pretty big. The building was wider at the front and narrower at the back, resembling a lion whose head is broad and body is slender. This resemblance earned the temple the nickname Ariel, lion. Within the holy, the section called the Holy were the menorah, the table of the showbread, the lechem hapanim, and the inner altar. Just talk about each one for a moment. Page 6, by the way. The menorah was made of pure gold. It had 7 branches. 6 of them were slanted. It stood on the southern side of the Holy, and the priest would light the menorah's lamps daily. The table, the lechem hapanim, was made of wood overlaid with gold. It held the showbread, arranged in 2 stacks of 6 loaves each. The showbread was baked from fine flour on Fridays and replaced every Shabbos. The loaves remained fresh and warm from week to week. No preservatives, by the way. The fact that your bread lasts more than a week it's not a big deal. It's out of the freezer. You get annoyed when it lasts 8 days. This bread had no preservatives and it lasted for an entire week, fresh, like it just came out of the oven. The altar of incense, the Mizbeach HaKetoras, also known as the golden altar, was a small altar, 2 amma high and 1 amma square, placed in the holy.
We are on page 7.
We are on the bottom, page 6.
No, the picture's on page 7.
The picture's on page 7, yeah, correct.
Eastward, west.
Where's east, where's west? So,
Page 7. So when you have a bottom picture, I think we're going from east to.
I'll tell you in a second, 1 second.
Picture. I'm guessing you just need to rotate it 180 degrees.
Yeah, probably.
Because you go from quarter to quarter forward.
It's probably east is to the right on the top picture, probably.
So the menorah was the southern side of the temple, so this area. So you see on that picture, the menorah is on the upper side. So that would mean that the furthest away from you is south. That direction. So when you're looking, the top is south, yeah.
Sun goes from.
So north would be on the bottom, and
Oh, so it
South.
faces east.
Left
it faces west.
And right is west.
The Holy of Holies is in the west.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, and then, the lower picture is the other way around.
Yeah.
It's like by angle, but okay. So
Yeah. Okay, we got our bearings. Baruch Hashem. Okay.
thank you.
Sure. Its purpose of this golden altar, the altar of incense, as its name suggests, was for burning cardboard. No, I'm kidding. Incense. The fragrance of the incense was one of the most wondrous scents in history, permeating all of Jerusalem, as we learned in a previous class. The Talmud praises the incense for its potent aroma, noting that Jerusalem's women and even brides did not need to use perfume. The incense was offered every morning on this altar. Okay, source number 3, Maimonides' Laws of the Temple, chapter 4, law number 1. This is on the top of page 7. The ark was placed on a stone in the western portion of the Holy of Holies. The jug of manna, the man, and Aaron's staff were placed before it. So the Holy of Holies, as the name indicates, was the holiest of the holy. It is the holiest spot on planet Earth. So the Holy of Holies is located in the western part of the temple, separated from the holy by a curtain. Only the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year on Yom Kippur. Achas Bashana, once a year, it says in the verse, where he offered a brief prayer. The most sacred vessel in the temple was the golden Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaKodesh, which stood on the foundation stone in the Holy of Holies. Inside the ark were the tablets of the covenant, and beside it was a jar of manna that Moses had commanded to be preserved from the days in the wilderness, serving as a reminder to the Israelites that it is God who provides sustenance. Okay, now that we've got more or less the basic layout of the temple, now we're going to focus on a very interesting detail about this layout. So section B, page 8, tiered structure. So source number 4, Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, Laws of the Temple, chapter 6, first law. He starts off, he gives us this absolutely must-know detail. The entire temple complex was not built on flat ground, but rather on the mountain's incline. Throughout the walk from the beginning of the temple, of the Temple Mount to the Holy itself, there are several flights of stairs, as you've seen. The simple reason for this is that the temple was built on the incline of a mountain. It was built on the side of a mountain. The ground was level as much as possible, but given the slope of the mountain, the temple was constructed in a tiered fashion, with the intersections of the temple situated at higher elevations. You can see this on page 8, what's the side view of the temple. It's going up slowly as you go along. Now let's see how the Rebbe looks at this. Okay, so the temple was built on the side of a mountain. So let's say the mountain is like at an angle like this. If they built the temple flat on top of that, everyone would fall down. So they built it like this to make sure that it. They built it somewhat. They built it flat, but they built stairs to get up to the next levels. Is there any significance to this? Of course, the answer is yes. So says the Rebbe, page 8. Maimonides begins with stating the entire temple complex was not built on flat ground, but rather on the incline. Why does he need to negate the notion that the temple was built on flat ground instead of simply stating the entire temple complex was built on an incline? He could have just said simple. Guys, here's the Chaim saying Yiddish. Listen up. The temple was built on a mountain, on an incline, on a slope. Great. But the Maimonides has to go further. He has to very much go into detail and say, it wasn't built on flat ground. Don't even think for a moment it was built on flat ground. Don't you dare think it was built on flat ground. I'm embellishing here. But it was built on a slope. Why do we need to know this? We can suggest that the reason is that the Mishkan, the one in the desert, built by Moses in the desert, was built specifically on flat ground. This would lead us to assume that the temple should also be built this way. As the temple design follows, we're on page 9 now, the temple design follows the same template as the Mishkan in the desert. Maimonides therefore begins by negating this notion, saying that the entire temple complex was not built on flat ground, but rather on the mountain's incline. That's a very simple answer. That's the simple answer. Why does he have to mention that it wasn't built on flat ground? Because the Mishkan in the desert was built on flat ground. It's built on flat ground. You would think that the Holy Temple of Jerusalem should follow the same model. To negate this, he says, it wasn't. But there's also a deeper dimension to the temple design. The function of the temple was to be, quote, a house for God prepared for sacrifices to be offered within, and, quote, we celebrate there 3 times a year. The spiritual meaning of this is drawing close to God through the offering of sacrifices and by ascending to the temple to celebrate the festivals. At these celebrations, the people would witness the divine presence. As the Talmud says, just as people came to show themselves, they also came to see. There was a mitzvah, we have a mitzvah, to appear in the temple 3 times a year. You know when 3 times a year? Close. Sukkot, Shavuot, and Pesach. Very good. Yeah. You know, your name is Pesach. But yes, we had a mitzvah to 3 times a year to appear in the temple, and the Talmud says and explains that just as we have a mitzvah to appear in the temple, so too we came to appear, so too we came to be seen. We came to see. I meant. From this, says the Rebbe, it is clear that every detail in the temple is associated with the divine presence that rests in the temple. In our case, the differing height of the various sections of the temple serves as a physical expression of the need to rise higher as one enters the section of the temple in which a higher level of the divine presence is present. Yeah, so as one progresses into the more sacred areas of the temple, there are steps that elevate a person to a higher physical level.
All of a sudden, you're just saying, okay, in the desert wasn't necessary, but now in Shiloh it wasn't necessary. In Noah it wasn't necessary. I actually read that after Givon, you were right, but Givon first wasn't necessary. Then when the Kiryat Yarim for the last couple of years, it wasn't necessary. And now in Jerusalem it is necessary. So what's such change?
Peter's asking a great question. He's asking, if the mic didn't pick it up, I'll just repeat it quickly. 1 second. We're saying that this is the reason why there's this elevation is because there's an elevation in holiness. You enter a holier section of the temple where the divine presence, another holier level of the divine presence is expressed, is revealed. So you have to, there's also a physical expression of that. You physically rise up higher. He's asking a great question. The Mishkan in the desert was an incredibly holy structure. It was built on flat ground. And this Mishkan, as it moved, it traveled, it was progressed throughout the years. Even when it was in Israel, in the land of Israel, it was still on flat ground. What's going on over here? Shouldn't it be also going up like that? Fantastic question. If the Rebbe didn't address it, I would have nothing to say. But the Rebbe does address it. We're actually going to learn about that. That question is going to be asked. So hold on tight. Okay. Source 5, the bottom page 9. Maimonides, Laws of the Temple, chapter 6, 1 through 4. First elevation. Let's go through it one by one. Thus, says Maimonides, a person who entered from the eastern gate of the Temple Mount would proceed to the end of the Chel on one level. Page 10 now, he would ascend 12 steps from the Chel to the women's courtyard. Each step was half an amma high and half an amma wide. Yeah, so we're not standing at the Temple Mount, just past the Soreg fence, which we mentioned earlier, facing the Chel, the steps, and entrance to the women's courtyard. The Chel and the women's courtyard are more sacred than the rest of the Temple Mount. Ritually impure individuals are prohibited from entering them. This increased sanctity results in the women's courtyard being at a higher elevation, requiring one to ascend 12 steps to enter. The height of these steps is approximately 3 meters. Okay, now we're going to the second elevation. The Rambam says, from the women's courtyard, one ascended to the courtyard of the Israelites, which is the beginning of the temple courtyard, using 15 steps. Each step was half an amma high and half an amma wide. Yeah, so after entering the women's courtyard, you walk along the plaza for about 60 meters on level ground. Here reach 15 rounded steps that ascend to the courtyard of the Israelites. The courtyard of the Israelites is more sacred than the women's courtyard. There are some ritually impure individuals who may enter the women's courtyard, but not the Israelite courtyard. Again, the higher level of sanctity is reflected in the steps leading up from the women's courtyard to the courtyard of the Israelites. The height of these steps is approximately 3.5 meters. Now we go to the third elevation. Going further, one would proceed through the entire courtyard of the Israelites on one level and ascend from it to the priestly courtyard using one step, 1 amma high. Above that step was a platform of 3 steps. Each step was half an amma high and half an amma wide. Thus, the priestly courtyard was 2.5 amma higher than the courtyard of the Israelites. Okay, so after the 15 steps, you cross the Nicanor gate, it's called, and walk into the courtyard of the Israelites. A few meters further, you encounter 4 steps with a total height of 1 meter and 20 centimeters. This is where the priestly courtyard begins. The priestly courtyard is even more holy than the courtyard of the Israelites. Only priests are allowed to enter this area, unless for the purpose of offering a sacrifice. The increased sanctity is reflected again in the higher elevation of this section. And finally, the last elevation, the fourth elevation. The Rambam says, one would proceed through the entire priestly courtyard, the area of the altar, the space between the entrance hall and the altar on one level. From there, one would ascend to the entrance hall using 12 steps. Each step was half an amma high and half an amma wide. The entrance hall and the remainder of the Heichal building were both on the same level. So after crossing the courtyard, you stand before the magnificent structure of the Heichal. The Heichal is more sacred than the courtyard. A Kohen, a priest who has not washed his hands and feet in the basin, is not allowed to go in. This increased sanctity is also reflected in the elevation of the Heichal's floor relative to the courtyard. 12 wide and majestic steps with a total height of approximately 3 meters lead up to the Heichal building. Okay. Says the Rebbe, page 11. Constant ascent. The fact that the temple was built on the incline of a mountain, on the slope, signifies, this teaches us, that one should never be content with their current spiritual status. Instead, there must always be a movement of ascent, continually progressing from one level to the next, rising higher and higher. I'll quote what it says in Hayom Yom. It's a small little book, a little bit of Chassidus every single day, literally one paragraph put together by the Rebbe. We had it recently, actually, I think. It was a month or two ago, maybe. It says, there's a statement from our sages in the Pirkei Avos. It says, Ezehu Asher, familiar with this? Ezehu Asher hasamech bechelko. Who is rich? One who is happy with their lot, with their portion. So it goes like this. When it comes to physicality, materialism, belongings, your physical wealth, your physical belongings, this is the greatest accomplishment, to be satisfied with what you have. In spirituality, in spiritual service of Hashem, it's one of the worst things to have, to be satisfied with where you're holding. The same thing that is positive in one area is the opposite in spirituality. Very interesting. So this is the idea that you should never be satisfied with your level of spirituality where you're holding and serving Hashem. You should always be going and striving for higher. That's the message. Okay. Section C, your question. Yeah, section C, we're going to address Peter's question. The tabernacle was completely level. Uh-oh. Why? Page 12. Now we have another question, the Rebbe says. Why was the Mishkan built entirely on flat ground? The Mishkan also had varying levels of divine presence. So why was this given physical expression the height of the different sections? Why was the Mishkan on flat ground? It makes no sense. To explain, the Mishkan served as a temporary dwelling for God. As the verse states, I, meaning God, have walked in a tent. Not a house, a tent. The temple was a permanent dwelling. As the verse states, this is my resting place forever. So this is the key difference here. The temple in Jerusalem was a permanent structure, was a permanent house for God. And the Mishkan in the desert was a temporary, like a tent almost, dwelling for Hashem. This is the reason why there was no enduring holiness in the ground upon which the Mishkan had stood after it had moved on, even though it was holy while the Mishkan stood there. By contrast, the ground on which the temple stood remains holy even after its destruction. This difference between the Mishkan and the temple was also reflected in the materials used for their construction. They were built differently. The main structure of the Mishkan was made from acacia wood, a material from the plant category of creation. The temple, however, was not built from wood. In fact, wood wasn't even allowed in its construction. It was built from stone, from the inanimate category of creation, and contained no visible wooden components.
Visible.
No, visible. Yes. There was a piece of wood there. Yeah. There was a bima. There was a structure they built for Hakel. Yeah. We see that the drawing down of the divine presence into the lowest elements of the physical world was affected specifically by the temple, which was constructed from inanimate objects, the lowest form of creation, unlike the Mishkan, which was mainly constructed from wood. Based on the above, we can understand why the Mishkan was on flat ground while the temple was built on an incline. The sanctity of the temple permeated through to the lowest level of inanimate existence and in a permanent manner. It therefore caused a change to the physical space of the temple, that the section of the temple that had a higher degree of holiness stood physically higher. The sanctity of the Mishkan, by contrast, did not descend to the lowest levels, to the extent that after the Mishkan had been disassembled, no sanctity remained in that place. It therefore didn't cause any difference in the height of the various sections of the Mishkan. It was all flat ground. In other words, in all the places where the tabernacle, the Mishkan, stood, you can visit and explore like any regular tourist site. You want to go on a tour to see the places where the Mishkan was? Gesundheit, as they say. Be my guest.
Yes, but no way to plan.
In theory. If you knew exactly where the Mishkan was standing, you can go there and visit and enjoy yourself.
You actually.
You're not going to burn if you accidentally walk over it. Why? Because it's not a holy place. When the Mishkan stood there, it was a holy place, but currently it's not a holy place. However, the Temple Mount, particularly the spot where the temple stood, remains holy, remains sacred, and walking there is prohibited. Today, there's even a sign at the entrance of the Temple Mount that states that the chief rabbinate, as representatives of the Torah, forbid visiting the area. This is because... No, I don't think so. Maybe they shouldn't. On this, I'm going to quote Rashi. Ani lo yodeh. Okay, I don't know. This is because the temple sanctity is... Yeah, he says it plenty of times. Yeah. This is because the temple sanctity is eternal and has permeated the ground itself. Even after the temple's destruction, the site and the land remain holy, and entering them in a state of impurity is forbidden, just as when the temple was still standing. The temple was a permanent house for God. It was permanent, and it permeated the lowest elements of creation to the extent that when they built the temple on this mountain, the physical structure of that area changed so that it would go up in what I'm looking for, in commensurate with the... I don't know if that's the right word, with the levels of holiness, the rising degrees of holiness. The Mishkan was a holy structure. It was temporary, and it wasn't there to permeate the physical world so much. So therefore, it sat on flat ground, and it didn't have the levels rising in holiness didn't permeate the physical earth that it stood on.
Wasn't the Holy of Holies in theory like holy before the Mishkan was there too? Like meaning, you know what I'm saying? Because it's like where Jacob like, went to sleep with the rock and stuff.
Yeah, but we're actually going to ask a serious question about the Holy of Holies in a moment.
Okay.
So the same question we're asking about the Mishkan, why was it on flat ground? We're asking a similar but backward question about the Holy of Holies. Okay. Ready? The crux of the question is like this. If every rise in holiness in the temple results in a physical elevation, why on earth between the holy and the Holy of Holies is there no elevation? The holy and the Holy of Holies were on the same level. How does that make any sense based on what we're saying? Seemingly, the Holy of Holies is the Holy of Holies. There should be 500 steps leading between the Holy and the Holy of Holies. But no, there's not even one step. It was the same level. What's going on? Section D, last section. Some things simply cannot be measured by height. Page 14. There is still another point that requires clarification. We are told that in the temple, the entrance hall and the remainder of the temple were both on the same level. This means that the Holy of Holies was no higher than the rest of the building. The different statuses of even the women's courtyard and the courtyard of the Israelites was reflected in the different physical heights. Surely then the status of the Holy of Holies as the holiest place in the temple should have been reflected in a different height. Nevertheless, the entrance hall and the remainder of the temple building were both on the same level. How could this be? How could it be the Holy of Holies wasn't any higher than the rest of it? To explain, when we are dealing with different levels of holiness that are relative to each other, with one higher than the other, this difference is expressed in the height of the physical place. And the place with the higher degree of holiness stands higher than the place with the lower degree of holiness. But when we are dealing with a completely different and incomparable level of holiness, a completely different stratosphere of holiness, which is beyond the very definitions of higher and lower, this difference cannot be expressed in physical height. This difference cannot be measured and reflected by height differences. The various sections of the temple that have degrees of sanctity that are relative, the women's courtyard, the courtyard of the Israelites, varied in their physical height. In order to reach the holier section, one had to ascend steps, 3, 13, or 15 steps, depending on the degree of spiritual elevation. But the Holy of Holies was on an incomparably different level than the rest of the temple. The Holy of Holies housed the Holy Ark with the cherubs on top, one at each end, representing the infinite divine light. While the Ark wasn't present in the second temple, it was still technically there. It was buried in a deep maze-like vaults underneath the temple. Since the holiness of the Holy of Holies was incomparably greater than that of the other section of the temple, it could not be reflected in physical height differences. The unique holiness of the Holy of Holies, supposed to say holies, was still connected with a particular physical space. It was in a particular area in the world, in the temple. This is why it was located on the foundation stone from which the world was created. But nevertheless, its unique degree of holiness wasn't reflected in greater physical height because its spiritual holiness is beyond the definitions of higher and lower. This is why the ascent of the Holy of Holies didn't have any steps, not even 1,000 steps, because its uniqueness was of a completely different type. Since its unique holiness couldn't be reflected in physical height, the Holy of Holies was on the same height as the entire Heichal building. So again, in other words, the holiness of the Holy of Holies was so beyond the rest of the temple. It was infinitely greater level of holiness. That infinite difference could not be captured by a physical height difference. And it would completely undermine it. If you put 1,000,000 steps between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, you'd miss the point completely. As it says in the Tanya, that the difference between 1 and infinity and 1,000,000 and infinity is the same. They're both infinitely apart from infinity. You can't. So any amount of steps would have not captured the incomparable level of the Holy of Holies. Just to bring out this point a little differently, the idea of incomparable, there was a story of the Rav Hillel Paritcher. Hillel Paritcher was a chassid. He was a follower of the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. He was a caliber unto himself. He was not a regular person. He was his genius, his level of holiness, his level of connection to Hashem was you can't even begin to grasp.
Good guy also.
Great guy.
genius, but
No, not genius in a that he's I'm better than you kind of thing. He was an incredible person. And he one time said, he was talking about the greatness of his Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. And he said, the difference between me and the Rebbe, meaning the Tzemach Tzedek, the difference between me and the Rebbe is like me and the cat. Is like me and the cat. And he explains, I don't mean that the same distance, the same level, I am beyond the cat. I'm greater than the cat is the Rebbe beyond me. No, when me and the cat are standing in front of the Rebbe, we're on the same level. So some key points. 1, the leveled and sanctified area of the Temple Mount covers approximately 620,000 square feet. 2, the Temple occupied a small portion of this area. Surrounding the temple was a fence called the Soreg, followed by the Chel, large steps leading into the temple. 3, the steps led to the women's courtyard. Then 15 additional steps led to the courtyard of the Israelites. 3 more steps led to the courtyard of the priests, and 12 further steps led to the Heichal, which housed the Holy and the Holy of Holies. 4, the Rebbe emphasizes that the tiered construction of the temple reflects the varying degrees of divine presence in each section. 5, every person should learn from this not to be content with their current spiritual level, but always strive to ascend higher and higher. 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, was entirely level because it was a temporary dwelling, and its sanctity did not penetrate the ground or manifest in its elevation. And 7, the Holy of Holies was not higher than the rest of the Heichal, despite its greater sanctity, because such an immense level of holiness cannot be measured in mere feet. And a takeaway that we should all walk away with is that a person should never be satisfied with their spiritual state. They should always strive to ascend to a higher level. All right. Everyone have a good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. Anything else I wanted to say? No, that's it. Okay. Have a great night.